Welcome, everyone. My name is Diana Bashur. Thank you for coming for this panel on the Middle East in a changing regional and global order, perspectives on militarism, security, and the political economy. We have three guests with us from the United States visiting the University of Vienna as part of a workshop of a few days with the Network of Security in Context in collaboration with the Syrian Center for Policy Research, based at the Department of International Development at the University of Vienna. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll have them speak for about 10 minutes each, and we'll open up the discussion for an intimate discussion. On my left is Shana Marshall. She's an Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs in the United States, where she teaches on political economy of the Middle East. She's a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and co-organizer of the project on global capitalism and transnational war economies with security in context. Her primary interests include the global military-industrial complex, the U.S. foreign policy, and the political economy of militaries in the Middle East. Her current research examines the role of private finance in the militarization of the tech industry. Dr. Marshall earned her PhD from the University of Maryland, and prior to joining George Washington, she held postdoctoral fellowship at Brandeis University and at Princeton. Sean Yom is Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University in Philadelphia in the United States as well, and Senior Non-Resident Fellow at Democracy in the Arab World Now. And lastly, Pete Moore is an M.A. Hanna Associate Professor of Politics at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Moore's current research examines the domestic and regional political economies of militarization and the fiscal politics of security. This research focuses on understanding how financial flows and global pressures shape domestic institutions and politics in the Arab states. He has previous academic positions at universities in Canada and in the Middle East. And he was visiting chair at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. So with this, I think we're really sort of lucky to have these speakers be present and tell us about this timely topic. So please, who would like to start?
Should I go up here?
Yeah. So it's the file is on the stick.
Thanks everyone for coming, especially those who got lost on the way. So, oops. Okay. So the I guess primary frame that I use to think about the military-industrial complex is that it's transnational, right? It's not the U.S. military-industrial complex or the European military-industrial complex. It is shaped by broadly the imperatives of capitalism rather than sort of nation-state security goals. So here I'm going to use these examples to sort of illustrate this idea. This is the image of the F-35, which is the U.S.'s sort of latest fighter jet. You can see it's branded by three large multinational military firms, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, and BAE Systems. And then you can see the flags of all the many countries that actually participate in the production of that system. The Turkish flag is no longer on there because Turkey is no longer part of the F-35 program, but they were initially. So that all these countries produce component parts that go into this jet system. And it's sort of a built-in way of ensuring that you have lots of customers, right? So in the U.S., a tank, for example, will have parts in it that are produced in all 50 states. And that ensures that the U.S. Congress will continue to vote for additional funding to produce more and more of those systems, even if the U.S. military says, we don't want any more, we've got enough, we don't have enough warehouse space to even house any more of these items, which is very frequent. And yet every year Congress will appropriate more funding for this because every one of their districts or states will have a piece of the production for that overall system. So this is sort of the internationalization of that U.S. Sort of production marketing model. And then on the top right, this is a sort of another example of this. It's General Atomics, which is a U.S.-based firm, now incorporates parts that are made by an Emirati military industrial firm into its weaponized drone system. So there are more and more of these partnerships with Gulf states and U.S. and European manufacturers. Here on the bottom left, this is a picture of the tank plant in Cairo. So these are M1A1 Abrams tanks that are produced by, designed by General Dynamics, and then assembled, and then in fact some parts are produced in Egypt in a factory that is owned by the Egyptian military, right? So if they were to export those revenues then would come back to the Egyptian military because they are a very important sort of political actor in the Egyptian political system. And then at the bottom right here is an example from Jordan. This is a joint manufacturing, a joint venture, sort of manufacturing production venture between this UK firm called Jankel or Yankel. I've never heard anyone pronounce it, so I don't know. And the King Abdullah, well, actually, not, it used to be the King Abdullah Design and Development Bureau, or CADB. Now it's the Jordanian Design and Development Bureau, or JODB. They took King Abdullah off of it, so if that tells you anything about the direction domestic politics is going. And then if you drill down sort of at a lower level to the sort of the level of the metals and the alloys and the base materials that are used in these systems, for example, Lockheed Martin has 13,700 suppliers that are based in 55 countries around the world. And Raytheon similarly reports it has about 14,000 globally dispersed suppliers in its supply chain. So a lot of the components that are going into these systems are coming from global south countries, usually ones with lower, cheaper production costs, including Mexico, which I mentioned earlier today. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin both have factories just over the U.S. border in Mexico where production costs are much cheaper. There we go. So a big part of the transnationalization of the military industrial complex, and what I look at is financialization. And part of what is driving financialization is the increasing consolidation of capital and wealth, right, in a smaller and smaller segment of global society, right? So as income inequality grows, large surplus capital amounts accrue to the very, very richest individuals, and they are constantly looking for places to invest their capital where they'll get a return. And because states tend to spend more and more every year on weapons, new weapons, expanded defense spending budgets, and that the government is going to back that up in the future, private financial investors, asset managers, people like this will tell super ultra rich people to put their money into the expansion, but into the military industrial sector, because it's sort of a guaranteed source of high returns. So when I'm talking about sort of this kind of global finance being private finance, I'm talking about not stuff in public markets. So not the stock market, not public bond markets. These are things that you as an ordinary individual cannot invest in, right? You need to have an asset manager, or you need to be part of a venture capital fund or a private equity fund to actually get access to investment in the sort of global private financial market. In the U.S., there's lots of news about private finance buying up apartment complexes and hotels, of retail chains and restaurants and veterinary hospitals and all of this kind of stuff, and sort of dismantling the brick and mortar economy of the U.S. So you see all these big businesses are constantly going out of business. Well, they're being bought up by private equity. And you're seeing some of the same things taking place in the military-industrial complex, except they don't go out of business, right? It just means it's more revenue, more investment for those military-industrial firms. And the same is true of venture capital. Venture capital is typically, you think of like Uber, Airbnb, any app you have on your phone, right? That was funded by venture capital. You tend to think of it in terms of these like civilian or commercial startups, but it's also an increasingly large part of financing new military industrial technologies and really non-industrial technologies like surveillance. So Palantir and Anduril and hundreds of other smaller companies that you may not have heard of are being funded by venture capital. And I keep hitting the wrong buttons. And this is not just happening in the U.S. It's very much happening because a lot of that capital is coming from the Gulf states. Do you know how long I've gone? How many?
It's 3 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So this is just an example of the sort of acceleration of this same model of venture capital investment in military industrial sectors in the Middle East. This is Anduril, right? That U.S.-based, very, very large military tech firm, and them signing an agreement to engage in the development of new products with the Saudi Arabian Militaries Industry, or SAMI, which is Saudi Arabia's military conglomerate. Here is Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. He has an investment fund that is capitalized with Saudi money and invests in a lot of Israeli military tech firms, including Elbit. So that is a direct sort of pathway between Saudi private finance and the Israeli military industry. And then over here on the right is just sort of a commercial example of this kind of the expansion of these linkages are not just in the military sector, but this is an AI-powered investment co-pilot. So basically an AI that tells you where you should invest your money, that is a joint venture between a UAE operator and an Israeli firm. And then down here, this is just another sort of headline about increasing ties between the UAE and Israel in the area of defense development. And then because we're talking about this tomorrow also, so the UAE is increasingly involved in Africa in private security corporations and also in arms smuggling and militarized sort of aid organizations. One is Emerald Solutions Group, which is an Emirati-owned group that contracts, is working very much in Syria. It's partially owned by, it's partially a joint venture with some UK firms in its operations in Syria, but it also apparently operates in Sudan, as I learned from a colleague today, and has been operating there for quite a while as basically a mercenary firm. And this image at the top right are two individuals from INARA, which is the International Network for Aid, Relief, and Assistance, and Emerald Solutions Group also contracts for them for their operations. INARA, interestingly, is funded by the Asbari Foundation of Ayman Asbari, who is a Syrian-born billionaire who lives in London, who had a large number of oil and gas companies, including companies that were exploring for oil in Syria and also elsewhere in Africa. So the ties between all of these different entities it's very much like a spiral. You see this International Golden Group logo. This is an Emirati firm. It's sort of a quasi-state firm, but they basically do the stuff that the Emirati government doesn't want to be seen doing, right? The really sort of nefarious stuff. They have been basically smuggling arms into a number of states in Africa from the Middle East on behalf of the Emirates. And then that guy in the bottom right is the CEO and founder of Paramount Defense Group, which is the largest defense firm in South Africa. And he had a large number of joint ventures with International Golden Group and also became sort of a conduit for the movement of weapons in and out of the Middle East and also into Russia and Ukraine and then also down into Africa. So these are some of the ways that the military-industrial complex is sort of imbricated, not just in corruption scandals and arms smuggling, but also the militarization of aid organizations in some cases like INARA, and their ties to sort of global finance. Duh.
Thank you very much.
Two minutes back there.
Yeah, I'll just minimize it. Would you like to go next?
Yeah, I will just go down next. Great. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I don't have any PowerPoints. I just have a few brief points to make on our general theme of what this point of inflection and thinking about security across the MENA region critically means and how this can reshape our understanding of prevailing concepts that we often employ in talking about security or insecurity in the region. And I think that these inflection points are important because they can help us problematize prevailing theories or old concepts in ways that I think push forward the frontiers of usable knowledge. So here's one interrogative I'd like to offer that comes from the ongoing reconfiguration of the security scape of the Middle East. And that is a reconsideration of what state power or stateness means. In political science for some time, at least in North America, there's been pushback against what we call methodological nationalism, which is the idea that states and states alone ought to be the conceptual container by which we understand orders of power, the origins of security, and how power is projected. But if you think about, I think, recent developments in countries like Egypt, where the Egyptian military has been a critical political and economic actor over the last decade, then I think we have to reconsider what it means in the contemporary region, basically to have authority and carry guns if you're not the state. Because conventionally, and again, Anglophone political science, we have this neat dichotomy between states and Weberian states that if they're not strong, you would call them collapsing states or failed states or dysfunctional states. And then you would often, and then for non-state actors that are armed and have the capacity to wage violence, we have a whole new lexicon of terms like militias or militia-like groups or factions or armed actors or whatnot. But contemporary Egypt, I think, offers us an aperture by which we can question how useful that very stark dichotomy between states and non-state actors that project power, that have authority and carry guns, how useful that dichotomy is. So I offer as an example what the Egyptian military is right now and what it's done to reconfigure the political terrain of the Egyptian, not state, just Egyptian life over the last decade. So one of the interesting things about the Sisi regime of Egypt and the Egyptian military over the last decade is that the Egyptian military under Sisi has branched out into domains of social and public life that has given it a prominent role in shaping the biological life cycle of an Egyptian. So I'll give you some examples. The Egyptian military has opened up an entirely new parallel school system in Bashur, which is a satellite city east of Cairo, that, in the words of one of my colleagues, Robert Springborn, strongly resemble the Napola. Right? These were the Hitler Youth Schools of Germany in the 1930s. In the parallel school systems that it's set up in the satellite city, which are designed to be quasi-private, and they cater to upper middle-class bourgeois Egyptian families, ostensibly for future technocratic careers in state or state-adjacent firms. Students are taught the values of Egyptian patriotism, loyalty to the army, discipline to Sisi, and order to become an organic part of the Egyptian nation. So it's a kind of almost organic inculcation using, I think, neo-fascist terminology to imbricate young Egyptian students for future lives of serving the military and the Sisi regime. That's the schooling system. Some of you might have known that over the past few months, a pretty big development has happened in the agronomic sector of Egypt in terms of the Egyptian military, or really it's an arm of the Egyptian military being given the wheat import monopoly of the country. So most of the wheat coming into Egypt now is now controlled by Egyptian military firm called Mustaqbal Misr. And from there, it's then distributed to naval bakers and wheat and wheat intermediaries and so forth. And at the end of that production chain, the wheat then is made into bread, right? The bread that the risk, right? The bread that Egyptians eat every day as part of their daily caloric intake. Many of us have heard things about the Giga project known as the NAC, the new administrative capital, which is now literally the seat of the Egyptian government. When Sisi took his most recent oath of office, he took it in the NAC. The NAC is not just a satellite city of Cairo. It's designed to displace Cairo as the political epicenter of Egypt. It's supposed to house, in the end, 7 million Egyptians, most of whom ostensibly will be middle class or upper middle sector Egyptians whose careers or livelihoods are based upon state service or they're adjacent to the state. But the interesting thing about the NAC is how big of a role the Egyptian military plays in its actual spatial arrangement. The new headquarters for the Egyptian military will be housed in a building under construction in the NAC called the Octagon. Right? The Octagon, if you look at the design, it's bigger than the Pentagon.
And it has 3 more sides.
Yeah, right. It's bigger than the Pentagon, and it's supposed to be in the nicest, most central, spatially anchored place in the NAC, right? And many of the, obviously, not even most because the NAC is so large, but a good chunk of the NAC is designed to house the officer corps of the Egyptian military as well. So, how do we think about the Egyptian military in this sort of setting? It's with 500,000 Egyptian men under arms that have authority and carry guns, but this is also an entity that now literally controls, in some sectors of Egypt, what kids learn, what their families eat, right? And where aspiring families want to live, right? In this new administrative capital, the NAC, outside of Cairo. Now, conventionally, we would say, well, the Egyptian military is the backbone of the Egyptian state. It's the deep state. From the state comes the military. We all know the history of Egypt since Muhammad Ali. But I would posit that this is a moment where we can actually ask daring questions, as in, is the language of stateness the appropriate vocabulary by which we can map out the possibilities of what the Egyptian military is trying to do? Because I think in instantiations like this, what the Egyptian military is becoming is something very different than merely the backbone of the state or an appendage of the state. It is becoming an institutional apparatus that precedes the Egyptian state, that often acts like a state, but it's not the state. It's not the state that employs 4 to 5 million people. It's not the bureaucracy. It's something entirely different that in many ways is mutually parasitic upon the office of the president, but it often acts with its own autonomy and agency, not necessarily with the weight of institutional state power, but on its own power. It's obviously not a mercenary force. It's tied deeply to the conception of Egyptian nationalism, the Egyptian state, and ostensibly it is part of the state. But again, it's not necessarily the state because the things it's doing, setting up its own schooling system, controlling what Egyptians eat every day in terms of where their bread comes from. These are state-like functions, but they are not doing it on behalf of the state. So among the new, I think, lexicons that we can introduce to talk about situations like this, where again, we're talking about organs of people who have authority and carry guns, but they're not the state. But they're not militias either. They're not non-state actors as we conventionally understand them. That lexicon can broaden to include concepts that we would normally use in the context of political economy. Things like elites, networks, gangs, right? I think terms like this better capture the complexity of how Egyptian political economy is reconfiguring now. And it brings into question again what it means to be living in this era where security is being redesigned and spatially reworded across the landscape, the physical landscape of Egypt and especially urban Cairo, but it's not being done by the state, but it's not being done by a militia either. It's being done by a different kind of actor whose role and evolution suggests that our own, I think, conceptual verbiage has to evolve to keep track of what we're seeing on the ground. So that's one area where I think critical security studies can add to our knowledge of the contemporary moment. The second, and this will be my final point, is I think this particular era allows us to think about how peace and the concept of peace can be weaponized and weaponized to wage further conflict. So one of the critiques I'd like to offer is one that I think we're very familiar with, for instance, what was the purpose of the Abraham Accords, right? About signing peace between governments that never wage war against one another. And many of us are familiar with the drones and the surveillance technologies and the defensive inputs and outputs that have been transferred between not just the UAE and Bahrain and Israel on the one hand, but also Morocco and Israel on the other hand, as a result of those 2020 normalization agreements. The Abraham Accords, I think, is important, though, insofar that it lets us see how in the terminology of prevailing Western diplomacy, how vessels of peace become Trojan horses for the waging of further violence, because I think many of us would argue that part of the reason why we saw what happened and what transpired in October 2023 was part and parcel an outgrowth of the Abraham Accords and an effort by one particular group to prevent Saudi Arabia or to discourage the Saudi government from signing its own normalization agreement with Israel. But that's just one example. The other example I'd like to offer is what's been happening, for instance, in situations or conflict scapes like Yemen and Libya, where if you think about, I know we have a tendency to tune out the conflicts in these countries because they have to stop and start dynamic. But what I would like to do, because in terms of just reading more into these cases recently, what happens every time overt violence stops in places between internecine factions, not between the U.S. and the Houthi movement under Trump and a few weeks ago, but between, say, in a place like Libya, between the IRG, the internationally recognized government, and the House of Representatives and the forces of Haftar based in the east. If you look at every strategic ceasefire and lull of fighting in places like Libya and Yemen over the past, say, 5 or 6 years, one really interesting thing happens the moment that there is some sort of arrangement to stop fighting the immediacy. It's usually an excuse for each faction to go back to their forward patron and rearm themselves or to retrench themselves in ways that ready themselves for the next round of violence. And I think this is especially important because in a country like Libya right now, where there is a UN-sponsored, multilaterally advocated unity government called the Presidential Leadership Council, led by its own unitary government, but the Haftar and the HOR factions are outside that group. These armed factions stand on the razor's edge, but the reason why they continue to stand on the razor's edge is because chronic ceasefire making, right, which is maybe a term that I want to introduce, becomes part and parcel of the cycle of violence. But the problem is that ceasefire making has its own political economy. It's the reason why certain multilateral institutions of the UN exist. It's the reason why there's a whole industry of diplomacy. Their sole purpose is to go into conflict zones and strike ceasefires. But what happens when those ceasefires become so imbricated into the reproduction of violence that violence requires ceasefires to be made to give each faction time to rearm and reassess their strategy? And in that case, multilateral bodies like the UN become participants in the production of violence in ways that they never intended. So I think that's another interesting implication of what the current security scape of the Middle East offers, and ones that I think hopefully provides fruit for future discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I want to offer 4 brief points thinking about militarization in the Middle East from both a political economy and a critical perspective. So the first point is what we mean by militarization. The standard definition is militarization is the increase in the military potential of a state. That definition, it's a very strong definition. It directs us towards various material measures for which the broader Middle East is regionally comparatively exceptional. When we look at GDP per capita spending on the military as a region, the Middle East is the highest. When we look at aggregate weapon sales over time, the Middle East is the highest purchaser of weapons. When we look at labor force as a percentage, and the percentage of your labor force that's in the military, again, the Middle East region is the highest. So I think in one way, one comparative view, yes, the Middle East is, by this definition, the world's highest militarized region. However, I want to stress that this definition of militarization is limited. In one sense, the data we're looking at, this data that I just sort of gave you a general overview, is, to use a word, it's uneven. Right? All states in the world protect and control the information about spending and militarization. And I think we could expect that the data that I just gave you is a conservative estimate, right? So in one sense, I want to suggest that militarization, it's the highest in the world, but I think this definition also misses aspects of militarization that are political, social, cultural, and institutional. And in that sense, despite the fact that the Middle East is the most militarized, there's significant variation across the region in terms of militarization. Second point I want to make is that any discussion of the history, the politics of militarization in the Middle East has to put the United States in some central role. Now, from the 1960s and 70s, the United States is not the only actor and not the only, if you want to use a driver of militarization, but I think it needs to be central to the narrative. And so when we look at the role of the United States, the period of replacing British imperialism in the 1960s and steadily through the 1970s as the United States begins to sell weapons first to the Shah of Iran and then eventually with Saudi Arabia, what we see is a multifaceted American role. So yes, weapon sales are key. But I think, again, this is where our definition of militarization needs to be broader. It's not just the sale of weapons, because the sale of weapons also involves relationships among what were called agents in the countries in which the weapons are being purchased. The U.S. relationship has also been deeply about norms building and training, right? The largest U.S. military training really in the global south begins in Egypt in the 1980s. It will transition to Jordan during the war on terrorism. But I think that training and sales speak to things that are much broader. They are not just top-down, they're part of ongoing political dynamics in a country. We could also stress basing, right? So one of the things about basing, U.S. basing in the Middle East, is it comes in multiple forms. We can think about Kuwait, which is the fourth largest U.S. military base in the world after Germany, Japan, and
South Korea.
Yeah. But also this basing is different, right? We have bases in Jordan that are, in my opinion, operationally probably more important than the bases in Kuwait. The education that the U.S. military training, education, and norms building involves a variety of relationships that are occurring in the country, occurring in bringing Arab military officers and enlisted people to the United States for education. So I think we need to place the role of the United States as central. The third point I want to make is that this militarization, as I said, it's varied. And I think the variation that we need to appreciate is the militarization or the preparation for war, if you will, the building of militaries, is part of ongoing social political processes in these countries. There are historical antecedents, and there are one could call them constraints, one could call them institutional controls. So just to give you, Sean talked about Egypt. So you have Egypt, one of the largest standing militaries in the region, juxtaposed to Jordan, right? One of the more, just in per capita terms, very large militaries. But as Sean said, the Egyptian military is a social actor, an economic actor. In ways, the Jordanian military is still embryonic in that sense. And I think the reasons for these differences between Egypt and Jordan can be tied to domestic historical trajectories. Also consider that we think about this region as highly militarized, but Tunisia never really had a military. It had a police force. Lebanon and Kuwait also have very weak militaries. The reasons are different, but they're domestically rooted. So I want to suggest that we also see militarization as part of domestic politics and the antecedents connected to it. The fourth point that I want to make is more of a question or a correlation to see that as we've seen militarization increase in the region from the 1960s and 70s, there is a correlation also with increasing violence, right? The historian Toby Jones calls this the long war. It begins in the 1980s with the Iran-Iraq war, and there's a fair argument to say that the violence that we see today is connected to these previous wars, that we see a long series of wars that are connected, that are operating off of one another. And so we have to ask the question, what is this relationship between militarization and broader violence? And that brings me sort of to the last component of thinking about this correlation, which is the critical security component of this is security for what or security for whom, right? And that's the question that can be asked, to be seen in variation across the region. But we also need to think seriously about a politics of threat inflation. That this is, yes, a region that has seen tremendous violence and is seeing genocide and social destruction that suggests that, yes, there are real threats out there. But we also need to recognize that this militarization operates off a politics of threat inflation. The threat inflation partially comes from the United States, which supports the basing and supports the necessity of selling weapons. But threat inflation is also a domestic component. The Hashemites have a threat idea of what the threat to security is in Jordan, and they will pursue a politics of inflating that threat as a means to garner more militarization and the political economy benefits that go around that. And on that final fourth point, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start us off with a few questions. My first interest is maybe just ending with your last point, Pete, in terms of militarization leading to more militarization, and for whom and for what, and what that means to the local population. So, can we see in terms of what can we say in terms of what these budgets for over militarization and securitization are taking away from national domestic, meeting national domestic needs, and so in cases where these are bolstered, and when states do enact sort of welfare policies like the ones you were mentioning, Sean, are these geared towards certain segments of the populations, and what does that mean for those who are not sort of targeted by these welfare programs? So what does that do also to the society as a whole in terms of cohesiveness, or not? That would be sort of maybe just a first question to start off.
So in terms of, this is the argument about diversion, right? That the more you spend on the military, you're diverting away from other areas. I think empirically we can see that. Sean and I have done work on the case of Jordan, and it's very clear that the Jordanian military buildup that begins in the 1980s begins to have, they could be seen as unforeseen, they could be seen as conflict management, but the strangulation of the rest of the civilian capital budget goes hand in hand with this. Is militarization the only factor of this sort of undercutting of the public sector in these countries? No, it's not. But I do think that part of this can be seen as a form of diversion. But I also want to highlight what is generated out of this, right? So you're losing something. The basic thing would be like, training teachers, things like this. Like you build a school, it's called like fire and forget. You got to developmental, social, and productively economic and culturally productive economic development involves future investment, right? So we are seeing that diversion and that sacrifice. But on the other hand, we're seeing it's generative, right? It is generating, as Sean said, a particular political configuration. It's generating, we could say in a simplistic sense, it's generating regime security. But I would argue it's also generating broad social patterns in which not just military officers become, political actors, but the institutions of security really are where you start routing everything, right? Whether it's foreign affairs or it used to be issues of education. And the final point on this military welfare, I think this is an important point, because one of the early arguments about this type of pre-American militarization in the region, the role of Britain, saw, particularly in some of these cases, that the British colonial strategy here was a form of what was called military Keynesianism. Now, this term military Keynesianism was developed in the interwar years to describe nation states going to war, interstate war. It's transferred by British political scientists in the 50s and 60s to justify what the Hashemites are doing. Today, you will hear Jordanian officials say that exact thing. All of this expenditure is a waste. No, because you don't understand. This one person represents all of these families. That was not military Keynesianism, and that is not welfare, right? That is a distribution, and it's highly regressive. Okay. And my final point is, if this is military Keynesianism and this is military welfare, then to come back to a state like Jordan, where we see political opposition in this country is indeed in the communities that are highly employed in the security sector. So if it's a military, if it's a welfare program, it's not working.
I just want to add, because based upon our recent work, not only is all of that true, but I think it maybe even understates the severity of what that relative over-militarization or the gigantic growth of the coercive apparatus in Jordan, what it fundamentally means for something as quotidian as social welfare spending. Because in some ways, the vast security and defense budget of Jordan, and this should not be understated, like since the 1980s, 2 out of every 5 dinars, right, in the national budget have been spent on defense and security, right? This is a country right now with a 22% unemployment rate, 48% youth unemployment rate, which makes it one of the worst 5 countries in the world if you're between the ages of 16 and 24 looking for a job. Right. So it's a country with very weak infrastructure, right, with tremendous brain drain, where the majority of youths under the age of 25 want to leave the country, right? So world beating youth unemployment, adult unemployment over the age of above 20-something%. 40% of the national budget goes to military and defense. And that's probably an understatement because, as Pete and I discovered, that doesn't include military pensions. And there are hundreds of thousands of military pensioners in Jordan. If you visited Jordan as an alien, you would think, God, this is a country that must have been in continuous war for the last 50 years because this is a wartime economy. Devastates civilian economy, terrible infrastructure, young people want to leave. There are no jobs. What war have they been fighting? None since Black September in 1971. So how do we get to a situation where this degree of extreme militarization generates a wartime economy for a kingdom that hasn't fought a war in 50-something years? I mean, that's interesting. One of the reasons is that part of that over-militarization or that hyper-militarization does have a distributive coalitional welfareist component, because there are certain sections of the Jordanian populace, we would call them Transjordanians or East Bankers or tribes or whatnot, that have become dependent upon this sort of economic lifeline, either salaries or pensions. Or one of the interesting nuances about the Jordanian armed forces is that it has one of the shortest time to pension service requirements in all of the Middle East. So to get a pension in the Jordanian army, you only have to serve something like 14 or 15 years. Even in the Gulf militaries, you have to serve 20 years to qualify for a pension. Right. So in the JAF, in the armed forces, you only need to serve something like 14 to 16 years in that range to earn your full lifetime pension and your ancillary benefits in addition to your pension, which, if you pass away, goes to your next of kin. The educational scholarships, the subsidized housing, the special food cooperatives, the royal medical services, they all extend at least 2 generations beyond you to cover your community. It's not unheard of if you go to towns like Ma'an and Karak to see entire families who are still dependent upon that one military sinecure from 30 years ago. Multiple generations of the same family tribal unit. And that's part and parcel of militarization. And that's what we talk about. I think what many of us researchers in this room mean when we think about the imbrication of militarization into the social fabric of some of these societies. It's not that it just produces violence. It's not just that it takes resources away from other productive ends. It's that it becomes hegemonic in its own way, right? Using that mundane definition of hegemony, where it becomes so embedded in your everyday reality that you cannot imagine a reality outside of that reality, because you just accept it as how it's always been. And that's the case in Jordan. This is how you get a country that looks like it's fought a war for 55 years, that has never actually fought a war in 55 years, to be spending money, to be militarizing, to be buying weapons, to developing real estate, to developing a defense industry, to be employing soldiers, as if it were fighting the war. But it's not. It's almost like a Kafkaesque kind of like absurd scenario. And that's just Jordan. That's just one case in the Arab world. So it brings, it's an interesting intersection of all the themes, right, that you were invoking. And it's fascinating.
Thank you. Shana, can I maybe just go back to something you were saying in terms of the interlinkages and the expansion of the weapons manufacturing and transfer network? And specifically, you mentioned Egypt and Jordan, where they had sort of production factories. So I was wondering, is that similar, sort of the rationale for expanding there? Is it similar to what you were also describing in terms of how the different states or in the US are sort of embedded in the network to make sure that, the interests remain? And also, how long has that been going on? And where are these products intended to? Is it the domestic market or regional markets, or are they for export? Or
Yeah, I mean, the idea, so in Egypt, when the first deal to sell those large tank systems was made between Washington and Cairo, it also came with a contract to actually build the factory itself, right? So that contract also went to the U.S. firm General Dynamics, and that contract and the contract for the tanks were paid for with U.S. military aid that went to Egypt. And so now they've had this contract, I think, for like 40 years or something. So they've obviously produced way more tanks than they could ever hope to use. And it's very expensive. They have to build new warehouse space to even keep these tanks. They have to have security to make sure that where they're being stored is people don't come, groups don't come in and, drive the tanks down the streets or something. And upgrades and spare parts and training and technical maintenance and all of these things is very, very expensive for the Egyptian state to maintain. But it does provide jobs and prestige to Egyptian military officers. And because it provides guaranteed future contracts to General Dynamics, there's a lot of relationships between U.S. Defense executives and, individuals who work in the military industry and the U.S. military and the Egyptian military, right? So there's lots of institutions where these people spend large amounts of time together. And they come to the U.S. through the military education and training program and through lots of sort of visiting scholar programs at U.S. Military universities. And it just sort of keeps the cycle going so that they know they can get follow-on contracts in the future. Egypt, I think, only really exported weapons, I think, to Iraq when it was under sanctions, I think. Is that, Pete, is that your understanding? Yeah, I think they sold stuff to Saddam when he basically couldn't get anything from anyone else. But Egypt does not have a large export market for its weapon systems. I think they have sold some stuff to poorer countries in south of the Sahel and in Africa, but they don't have a large market. Jordan, on the other hand, has exported quite a bit to other countries. They produce relatively cheap but pretty, sophisticated weapon systems. They have like backpack fireable drones that you can go and assemble like in the field. They have a huge range of armored vehicles with all kinds of surveillance capabilities built into them. They have a lot of border security weapons systems and monitoring and surveillance and sensor systems. I follow them on Twitter. So I see all the new sort of weapon systems that they're coming out with all the time. And they do manage to sell those to countries in Africa. And then sometimes as a political sort of a way of greasing the sort of political relations with other countries, they will buy things from Jordan, not so much because they need the equipment, but to sort of develop closer political ties with the country, which is exactly what the Gulf states, for example, do when they buy planes from the U.S. and from France and from the U.K., right, that all perform the same function, none of which, are interoperable with each other. And so they end up with way more planes than they need, but the French are happy and the British are happy and the Americans are happy. And it solidifies those ties. So, yeah, it's a lot of political sort of maneuvering also.
Yes. Noura, Christian, Tabia, Walid also.
Thank you for this very stake. But I had a couple of questions. Like, firstly, in relation to Egypt, like, how would you frame sort of this new like Araghani group in terms of like the Egyptian military? That how do you see this connection somehow with why do they create this new other militia that were imposed in Sinai, and how was it relate to the Egyptian military? And my other question is like well, firstly, like with Jordan, I mean, it's not a surprise that it does that much as spending. Like it does fulfill its job as a protector for Israel or for the so it's one big base basically for the protection of Israel. But what I'm actually interested in is like in regards to like the retirement like laws and like this pensions and like is this also taken somehow from the British Mandate era laws? Like a lot of laws and this regard with Palestine are basically taken like taken down from British Mandate era laws. So I'm just wondering is there is still this connection as well in Jordan?
Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for these representations. They're all really interesting and to remind me of fact are probably paying enough attention to some of the issues you're discussing here. This is a question for Shana, but also for everyone. I think maybe you could have some reflection on this. I was really interested about your point regarding infinite money power of this current moment in the sense that there's the sort of billionaires approaching trillionaires even face a crisis of overaccumulation. So they're kind of really desperate desperate is not a word.
To find a place to pay their money for.
New opportunities for their vast amounts of surplus capital. Do you think there's a link between that and what Shaw was describing, for example, the kind of I don't know, maybe you could describe it as kind of the biopolitical nature of militarization in the sense that they're increasingly seeking opportunities in the kind of infrastructure of war, security, humanitarianism, and genocide. So, for example, I recently saw that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you can invest in that. So a Boston hedge fund has invested in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established with the Chicago-based hedge fund. Boston himself over. So also being defies this. So this is like a corporate machine, right? A corporate entity, completely. It apparently makes money, but is there a link between this kind of infinite money power and this? It's a big picture.
And even high people make this.
Yeah, that's actually how I find a lot of information about these firms is because they post jobs on LinkedIn, so that's how you find out what they're doing. Yeah, it's incredible.
Rabia, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And two questions. I think I will link to the last idea about the reproducible economies. But I will start by like this two phenomena. Like in the last few years, we have a transnational military elite, which is coming with Saudi Arabia expanding its military arm, Emirates, Iran, Turkey. So we have an expansion beyond the borders in terms of military. And on the other side, we have more grand state actors who are bringing a new elite in this military class. How this reform the structure of military order and in the last 50 years, from your opinion? And from that, how this related to the crony capitalists? So how are they part of this mechanism, or they are competing with the cronies who are linking to Sisi or to any of the authoritarian regimes?
We'll take one more question and then lead.
But I mean, sure, you nice or whatever. It's kind of like that combines U.S. stuff. The Middle East and thinking about this question.
The first is this night, the notion like, is there an impact? Can you see, like, during the Trump administration, any impact in terms of militarization, increasing, decrease, transformed in any way? I'm just kind of curious, or does this process kind of operate sort of disconnected from things like that kind of politics? The second question is more open-ended, and it's basically, can you conceive of a way to sort of unwind this militarization in different ways? Or should we just be thinking about militarization as this is what politics is. This is what capitalism is. This is whatever, like it's an incurable disease, that this is what we mean by politics. It's not somehow a deformation of what we thought of as politics is what politics is now.
Who would like to start that of questions?
I can talk about Christian's question. I've thought about this a lot, this crisis of the overaccumulation of capital. The flip side of which, right, is the immiseration of the people whose capital has been extracted, right, in order for it to accumulate, right? That's where the money comes from, right, is the extraction from labor. And that creates violence from the immiseration of larger and larger populations, right? So that's literally like a simultaneous process. But I think a lot of it is the decline of the non-militarized productive economy in the U.S. and Europe, right? So you had zero interest rates for a long time, right? Because the U.S. was trying to like pump up its economy after the financial crisis, and then because of COVID. So very wealthy people could borrow huge sums of money to invest at essentially zero interest rates, right? And so you saw these things in Silicon Valley, these different projects popping up, which were absurd, because they didn't work, right? So you had Theranos, remember the woman who said she could give you like a genetic makeup from pricking your finger, and it was supposed to revolutionize like public health in poor countries or something. And the science literally just didn't exist. And it went on for years. And she got huge investments from like Henry Kissinger and all these other, like the Carlyle Group and all these presumably very like plugged in, smart investors. And it turned out it was just a complete fraud. And there were many, many other sort of WeWork. Remember how many billions of dollars did that guy just burn through? And there's no product. And things like Airbnb is just taking something that is a real part of the economy and financializing it and sort of eating away at it and destroying it. So there's so many ways in which like the productive economy in the global north has just been so hollowed out that in a way the only place left to put money that is real, right, where these people know that they're going to get huge returns, is in the weapons industry and in surveillance and in intelligence technology and these different places, even if it, again, doesn't work, because a lot of times it doesn't. So these firms will say, oh, this is autonomous or AI enabled, and it's total bullshit, right? It's like there's still a guy sort of with a joystick, somewhere in like the Philippines or something, who's like working toward powering these things. And they'll come out at these big, conferences on these stages to show how things work. I went to one of these in DC last year. And there was a guy with like a drone, and he was like talking about how amazing it was, and he could operate it from Riyadh or something, and he couldn't even get it to fly in this huge convention center that had like secure Wi-Fi and everything else. It just didn't work.
Running Windows 98.
Literally, it's incredible, and so you'll see a lot of those things kind of get huge, valuations and large investors rounds from venture capitalists and stuff, and they just never produce like an end product. But when it does, when it's Palantir or when it's Anduril, those people literally make billions of dollars. And so as long as there's one sort of really big one, they're okay. But in civilian tech, you haven't had any innovation since like the smartphone and cloud computing. There's been nothing since then that has really made a difference in anyone's life. Remember Google Glasses? No, because nobody wants those, right? So they keep trying to come up with the next thing and everything just fails except weapon systems.
So what about AI though? That you would put that in the military, you can't.
Yeah, I don't think it works in the military equipment that they've tried to use it in, right? They try to use it in these like dashboards where it's going to like generate all this input for you. That's just machine learning. That's not AI, right? It's just algorithms. It's just better algorithms. And like, oh, we're going to have this robot dog that monitors like the US-Mexico border. There's still somebody in an office who's looking at the data that comes in and trying to determine like what to do with that data. It's not like the robot dog makes its own autonomous decisions. It's not artificial general intelligence. I think they're so far away from doing this. I don't think it exists.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna just a few. So on Jordan, but I think it's important to recognize that this sort of, if we call it a strategy of regime survival, this was put in place by the British really before the creation of the state of Israel, right? But of course, and I think we have to recognize again, this is where the 70s come in. I mean, King Hussein survives the Civil War, and that we know it was in the diplomatic history. That's when the Israeli leadership and the Nixon administration embrace the Hashemites as they're going to survive, right? There's this famous quote by Nixon in the middle of the of Black September. He's like, they're all falling. Vietnam's falling. Jordan's falling, right? I think that it is important, but it's part of a history of change in a sense. And I think what changes after the 70s is scope and scale of what militarization is going to be in Jordan. This question of like transnational military elite, yes, right? We see this at military schools. I see it in Paris. I've seen it in Washington, D.C. I've seen it in Germany and in the UK, right? And you're exactly right. The training that we're talking about is not just bilateral, and it is bilateral. That's where a lot of the norms building. But one of the things that has also changed is you bring all of the officers in, right? And you physically have them there. And I think that's really interesting. And the other part, but I have less sort of vision on this. I do, and this is why I say you have to put the U.S. at the center or somewhere near the center of this narrative, but it's not the only one. Yes, the creation of non-state military elites, whether we want to say Hezbollah, whether we want to say Iran, the Yemenis, these others, I do think this is what's going on. I do think we're seeing a new military elite that is emerging from both conflicts, right? Because what's shaping Yemen is not just Iranian support; it's also experience in this combat. I don't have really a full answer on that, but I think that's really interesting to point that out. And that's something that I think is lacking in our analysis because we're primarily American-centric, state-down, and non-state actors. The question about the Trump administration effect on the military, that's a really good one. Right now, it's hard to see it, but I think in the previous administration, the previous iteration of Trump, I think your answer is it was disconnected. Because one of the things I like to stress about the American role, to try to think about it as social, cultural, and it's programmatic, right? And that's the big difference when we hear about money coming from the Gulf. Money coming from the Gulf is not programmatic; it's parachuted in. The American thing comes with expectations. The social advancement component here cannot be underplayed. The ability to be an officer in Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and speak English well enough to get in to this training program is a significant investment. It's a social investment, and it comes with various benefits. So one thing so right now I don't know, but I think this programmatic nature and the growth of the American national security state, to a certain extent, insulates those, particularly in the Middle East. Your other question, I think, is is there a way out? So I would say first, in my own analysis historically in Jordan and using Kuwait, in Jordan there were pathways off, right? Tell in the 1960s laid down an idea of a different kind of Jordanian state. I don't want to overblow this, but I'm just saying this idea that it's one giant thing. No, there had been ideas. There was another idea in the 1980s for Jordan to reform. And so I do think that what we're seeing is not, it's not overdetermined. And another example I would give would be Kuwait. So I think that we need to stop seeing Kuwait as the outlier, the exception. It's the norm. It's the Emirates. That's the little Sparta is the outlier. Why? Because in Kuwait, militarization is constrained through the messiness of Kuwaiti parliamentary politics. They were able to pull in the 1990s weapons deals into that messy politics. And I would say that the Sabah were not, they did not fail to militarize, they were defeated. That still does not answer the question of, where is there a way out now? And is militarization becoming politics? I think that's an important question.
I mean, I would just say that the language of path dependency, which is typically the verbiage we use to describe this intense degree of self-reproducing militarization in which there seems to be no way out, because the longer you do it, the higher the cost of exit, and therefore you're locked in over the long term. I mean, at least in some parts of Anglophone political science, there are more nuanced ways in which we talk about path dependency, because it's not static. It's not as if there are no off ramps. There are possibilities of change. Just because an institutional trajectory doesn't explode and rupture at a particular period of time does not mean that incremental change is possible. The problem is that, I think, for countries like Jordan or Egypt or now increasingly Morocco and obviously Algeria, they're half the Gulf, where the political and the cultural commitments to militarization have not just been unimpeded for multiple generations now, but they've been rewarded, right, by outside patrons because they are doubling down on militarization. All those off-ramps that these states could have taken over the last generation are gone, because I think that certain hiccups in regional order, like the Arab uprisings, that represented one off-ramp, but most of these states didn't take it. In fact, countries like Jordan tripled down, and they just spend more and more on their militaries after the Arab uprisings, despite the fact that Jordan was in a relatively good place in terms of its regime security. So what I wonder in terms of thinking about military, like the outcome of this hyper-militarization, the path-dependent fashion is what's going to be next decade's off-ramp? What's going to be the off-ramp that these countries or these states could take, say, in 5 years or 8 years? Because generational moments like the Arab uprisings are generational for a reason, right? We have to wait a long time to see them happen. So it's certainly not, I mean, maybe it will come through some systemic rupture in global order. That's the only thing that comes to mind. Or it could come as maybe as a result of the natural fiscal exhaustion of some resource-poor countries like Jordan that at some point realize we just can't spend 40% of our budget anymore on the Interior Ministry and the Jordanian armed forces. I mean, we can try, but at some point, there's only so many years you can have 24% unemployment and not have a revolution on the streets. It's a depressing outlook, but they're off-ramps. There are possibilities of incremental change, but the particular mafias and elites in charge of these states just don't seem to take them. And that's, I think, what worries me the most as someone who looks at the region from a distance. I just want to answer that one question about the Organi group. This is like Ibrahim Organi is like sort of like his militia business group, which is fascinating. If any of you have heard of this guy, Ibrahim El Ordani, who last year promised to build a city on the Egyptian border with Gaza, like adjacent to Rafah, called CC City. So the reason why this is interesting is that this guy El Ordani also before was like a self-styled tribal militia leader who was in charge of the paramilitary force in Sinai that was delegated by the Egyptian armed forces to fight ISIS in Sinai. And now he's building monument cities in adulation of his patron Sisi. Now, he's not military, right? But he's linked to the military. He's also linked to some of the local communities. He's linked to the President Sisi, obviously. I think that this is part of what some of my discomfort, originates in thinking about, again, how do we problematize the authority of groups of people who who have power and have guns, but they're not the state, but they're not what we would call like, the stereotypical Western vision of a militia where you're somewhere in the desert around a campfire with Kalashnikovs and you're going to kill someone soon. Like, that's not a militia in the modern Middle East. These are non-state actors. I guess that would be a clumsy term, but that's the one we're most accustomed to using. I prefer the term mafia. Because if I think about the Egyptian military's behavior economically over the last 10 years, it's a mafia-like behavior, right? El Organi is a mafia leader, right? I think that at the most we can talk about state-like militaries that adopt state-like functions like the Egyptian military. We can talk about military-like states, but I think that in that gray netherworld between states and non-state actors where we find some military institutions like the Egyptian military evolving to, that's where the good conceptual stuff is. I mean, groups like the El Organi, like militia group, like his umbrella group, I think that the language of criminality and gangs and mafia is, to me, the closest approximation to that behavior, because it's based upon extortion. It's based upon seizing a monopoly over a public good, over a confined territorial space, and extracting tribute from those who don't, either requiring those who don't agree with you to exit or to give you tribute, right? So who's going to live in CC City? Right? People who want the protection of that group. Right? It's a mafia city, and they're building it across from Rafah, which is like incredible to me.
But why there? What's the reason for them to build it there?
Locationally, I don't know the politics. I just know that he made the announcement exactly 1 year ago, saying like it's atop the side of a pre-existing village, and he said, "This is going to be the city that I'm going to call CC City, to you, my leader." Right? Like, I just the head of the Cosa Nostra of Egypt. But I think the Egyptian military acts in no different of a way. It has a monopoly over wheat in Egypt now. It's decent control of the public school system, and now it has exclusive control over large sectors of the newest, most livable city in Egypt. Who gets to live there? Well, it's not an open market.
The Poderosa means our thing.
Yeah.
But so why are they like giving him all of this? Like can they just like integrate them within the military? Is something that's like.
Well, I mean, if you think about, I saw every season of The Sopranos, so I've seen a lot of mafia movies, and I've had a few ChatGPT discussions about this. I mean, if you think about how the stereotypical kind of like the business model of a mafia, it's a hierarchical organization, but it's not a unitary entity, because like every element of that business family has their own extortion racket. They just kick tribute up above. That's kind of how I think El Organi is fitting in. I mean, he's like a capo in the regime. He has his own racket. He's kicking up tribute to Sisi. And maybe like the military is just a different aspect of that Cosa Nostra, and they kick up their own tribute to Sisi and vice versa. But it's not a unitary thing, right? And I think here the language of stateness isn't the right lexicon to capture this. It's more, again, I think it's mafioso behavior. And it's happening under the carapace of the actual Egyptian state. So it's not the Egyptian state doing it, even though that it will be built by construction firms tied to the Egyptian state. But the actual impetus is coming from this gray zone between the military and the state. But that is modern Egypt now, I think. And increasingly, like it's the modern landscape in a number of other Arab countries. I think if they rebuilt Libya, Libya's going to be a lot like this, and perhaps possibly Yemen as well.
I have a question from Samai.
Yeah, thank you all for your intervention. I have a question that's prompted by something that Sean said on naively the imbrication of the UN in militarism and Arab war, and you focus specifically on their role in negotiating ceasefires, and it got me thinking about other ways in which they're implicated. And we can take this security sector reform efforts as another example, which then opens the door for trainings and army, etc. And I wanted to ask both Shana and Diana to comment on this, because one, I'm just interested, Shana, like to what extent you're thinking about the transnational military industrial complex is also looking at multilateral institutions like the UN, and I can also think of the African Union here too, and the role they play in Somalia. And Diana, as somebody who's worked at the UN, just any comments you have on this implication and all that?
Would you like to add it? Or are there other questions?
I just make the point when you talk about the mafia model. I like that, but it's also, I think back to, like state buildings, organized crime. And, in the sense, like what's going on here, it's like the same structure that has no obligations to do state functions. And to what degree do other states actually in the region have that obligation? They need to provide services or to do what it's like they do in another being. So that is kind of state building. Like like you almost collapse them in a bigger process rather than it's like the state and this other thing.
Yeah. If I could just quickly intervene, because that just triggers. This is one of the. I go back. We're all in many ways students of Tilly in our conceptions of state building, at least in our early, our graduate education. But one of the things that I just the analogy that Tilly and his contemporaries, in which they talked about state making or state building as organized crime. And one of the things, the only part about that metaphor that sometimes I recoil against is that it does incubate a kind of teleological impetus, that it does begin as organized crime. It's racketeering, right? It would be covered under RICO laws in the US now, but there's an end goal that the mobile bandit becomes a stationary bandit. The bandit wants to be stationary. He sees an end goal to becoming a stationary bandit, to institutionalizing crime, then you become a state. Whereas I think now, like, there is no teleology to what I see happening in some of these countries in terms of security. It's fractious, it's profiteering, it's parasitic upon global capitalism, but there's no teleology. Like, there's no end vision. It's just, we can squeeze out something from nothing, let's do it. And who cares what the local communities who will suffer from that. But on the positive side, if we push the metaphor of mafia-like behavior further, we could say, these are maybe children of the Egyptian state. Now they're just going back to their roots, right? Going back to organized crime from where sociologically states are supposed to originate from. But it gives us food for thought, at least, in terms of nomenclature. So, yeah.
Thank you. Just on your question, Samar, actually, on my work, when sort of I was working there, I didn't have any sort of direct impact on that, or sort of anything specific that I would sort of be privy to talking about. So I'll defer to Shana.
A lot of people I think thought about this. Rafik Ziada, I think, right, writes about the sort of militarization and securitization of like humanitarian logistics zones, right? For example, the UAE has that huge humanitarian logistics port, which is used by every UN agency, all the international orders and development agencies, and I'm 100% positive is also used, right, for the import and export and smuggling of weapons, because they're all going to the same zones. They're like, oh, well, that huge thing of vaccines is heading to Djibouti. Well, let me go ahead and just put a couple extra, cargo of not of weapons along with that. And the areas are incredibly, securitized. So they're also deploying those same surveillance and monitoring technologies in those areas. And like the UN using the biometrics to register all the refugees and stuff. These are military tech firms that are developing these technologies that are being used by development agencies for the distribution of aid and other sort of forms of assistance. So it's totally like one and the same to me. And then also that I was thinking about the transnational military elite, and I think it is directly related to, I wouldn't say crony capitalism, I would just say capitalism. So the one, that UAE example, International Golden Group, is owned by the Al-Kaabi family in the Emirates, which is were not traditionally sort of from the merchant elite, but came up through, I guess, rising up the ranks of the military and the higher level officer corps. Right. So that is how, that transnational military elite is very much emerging. And that's just one tiny example. There's hundreds of examples in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia of the emergence of this sort of new military elite, for sure.
And competing with like traditional elites or very
Yeah.
related?
Yeah, so the state, I mean, in the Emirates, they went to these guys and they were like, we would very much appreciate it if you sold to us all of your companies, right? And and most of them, of course, did. And that's why you have that huge conglomerate edge in the Emirates that now has, hundreds of companies within it. Many of those started out as privately owned companies that were operated by just wealthy merchant families that lived in the UAE who were in import-export business. And then so, it might have been luxury items and automobiles, and then it became sort of more and more sophisticated sort of weapons components. So, yeah, for sure.
Let me give you another example of this, like thinking, so you said transnational, right? And most of my research has been, national. But I want to highlight that sort of what we've laid out should not be seen as a very strong structure, right? Because here's an example from my own research. So one of the individuals that I followed very closely spent 20 years in a military, retires as a 2-star brigadier general, served the country, has children that wants them to have the best education they can. The pension at a 2-star brigadier in this particular country gets is a great pension in comparison to other public sector servants. It has benefits, but the comparison is not with other brigadier generals. The comparison is with the conglomerate that built the mall in the city, where the mall and all of the speculation around it and capital accumulation means that the person that built that mall, that person can send their children to school in the United States, can buy their children the kinds of things that the 20-year service cannot. Now, imagine the socio-political problems that can emerge when you have elites both supporting a regime that have differential benefits based on very strongly held views that are national, social, symbolic, and that can involve issues of political identity. So what I'm suggesting is that might be an understanding of post-military career corruption. But that's just one facet of it, because you have to think about this as a collective social dynamic. And I think that that's where these transnational elites, it's a business model, as Shana says, because you're just trying to build something that will be bought off. But I think there's another politics going on here that suggests that what we just laid out here is not something that is like, an edifice of stone. It's not quite a house of cards, but it's not as strong as what we all imbue the military to be.
But can I just add one tip for this? Because also I think there is less constraints on your behavior if you are a military elite working outside your country. Like Emirati or Iranian working in Syria, they have less constraints in terms of the pillage, the destruction, or the accumulation of wealth. Also, I think maybe this also an additional character to this, like binary report, the socio-economic binary report.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like seizing Socotra. Lord, man. Seize an island.
I'd like to just give an example of like this, the UAE and its sort of many tentacles. An example maybe that's a bit less known, at least it was to me when I was doing the research on weapons transfer from the global north into the Middle East and how this impacted Syria. The UAE not only produces and sort of supports, but actually it was buying weapons from the Balkans.
Yes, yeah.
So basically warehouses which were, just rusting. So from Soviet area, no one would buy them. They're not going to use them. And so they bought it through many companies, one of which was headed by Mohammed Dahlan. So a Palestinian, really like incredible. And so they were buying these weapons and they ended up in Syria. Weapons that, sort of no one would be using. So, parts of the many sort of tentacles that this country is having.
Yeah, never really.
Yeah, nothing goes to waste.
Nothing goes to waste.
Yeah.
it's a form of recycling.
Yeah.
It's a
Okay. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the panelists. We're just about out of time.